All right, guys, Anthony with Austin's Darker Weapons Guild here again at Vigilante. Tonight we're going to start digging into some of Meyer's Rappier stuff, specifically the section on parrying. I'll fully admit this is not one of my strongest weapons ideologically. I'm not great at naming all the guards. He has a whole bunch of fancy cuts and thrusts he talks about, which I 100% can't do nearly as well as I would like. That said, there's a lot of really great information in here. Once you get past all the form, how to do things, what to call things, kinds of actions, I think is really useful. The first section of that is talking about the 7 kinds of pairings, which actually has 8 parts to it. Let's talk about some of those tonight, some of those next Friday, and kind of see where things line up, see where things go. Few things again about Meyer's Rappier. Even though he calls it a rapier, it's really a side sword. You can kind of see it is very short compared to the stuff we're working with on the fabric things. I believe this one overall is about 39 inches. Things of note, things to really pay attention to is that it's got a nice knuckle bow here, and it's got a nice big ring or nagel or anything like that. So we're really kind of looking at this as a side sword, not a rapier. He treats it like a side sword, not a rapier, at least not the Italian rapiers we think of a little bit later period. So just kind of keeping that in mind, even though it's called a rapier, it's really more of a side sword, really meant for cutting and thrusting. Whereas a rapier, if you're watching other videos, is pretty much all about the thrust, and you don't want to do any kind of wasting time with anything else. So into the rapier. As I said, he has 7 ways he talks about parrying. And for me, this section was always really interesting because in longsword, we're kind of giving it that parrying is bad. So this is interesting because not only is he describing what these parries are, we see a lot of terms that we associate with longsword things that are good technique, that are in the Licknauer tradition at least, and he calls these parries. So it really starts to highlight the ideological, pedagogical trend of, okay, so if we're going to parry, and we should be parrying now, this is how we want to be parrying. And you'll just see these are not just those big, dumb kind of like I swing at their sword parries, but they're definitely highlighting all the good things we always talk about with other weapons of keeping the point on line, keeping yourself protected, keeping the enemy threatened, things like that. So the first parry is setting off, and this is pretty much Obsetsin, or this is Obsetsin setting off. This is pretty much the basic, picture perfect parry, counter thrust, different kinds of things about. Meyer describes a lot of these starting in a low guard. Low guard for Meyer is basically single-hand flug. I want low sword pointed up towards my opponent, off to the side. This can be done on either side. Sake of brevity, sake of ease of translation of doing, everything's done from the right. So again, working with these is done from the low guard. Unfortunately, I don't have anything dynamic to actually throw cuts or thrust. I mean, so I have to pretend my pal here is doing things actively. So this first one, the Obsetsin, very simple. As that thrust comes in, I'm extending out my long edge, catching the cut or thrust from my opponent, and able to drive that through and keeping myself safe. So again, really simple. I'm this low guard, bringing out that long edge of my blade, the front edge of my sword, to catch their weapon, catch their attack, and I'm able to drive through, follow through the attack. You can do this from all sides. He says from the 4 stances. Doesn't really highlight those, at least in this section of the book, but it's going to be low guard on either side, and of course, in these high guards, either side as well. So we're already seeing a really strong, really simple parallel between this and longsword. You have 4 quadrants with a point forward, high, and low on either side, right? And from any of these positions, we want to be able to do this kind of Obsetsin the setting off parry, where I'm just working as the attack comes in, driving out, moving up, working from there. Really just getting this habit, practicing that, being able to drive towards a closed line, setting things off. Really important as you're working on this, if you're practicing this along, get in the habit of driving that towards, your own center line. I'm not pushing this really wide and cutting this back across. As this cut of this thrust comes in, whatever I'm setting off, I'm finding that center point before they get there. So if someone throws a cut, I'm there first. I'm not attacking their blade. I'm not pulling this offline because now I can no longer follow through with my thrust. Just really making sure I'm here, comes across, follows through. The next is the Abschneiden, which is the slicing off. And I find this really interesting because I don't think I've had this on the Lou reboot that I've been doing, but my idea of Abschneiden did not match this at all. So I'm curious if Jude Liu, when he talks about it, if it will match what we're doing here, or if it matches more what I have in my head. But regardless, the Abschneiden involves kind of a straight parry and then cutting down and through. So again, we're starting in that same low position, that low guard, and as their cut comes up, I'm actually raising my sword and getting even lower. He really highlights about getting your hilt to your knee or below it. And obviously I can't do that if I'm upright, right? Body language or body proportion says to get below my knee, I need to start bending, maybe dropping my back leg as well, getting that nice low stance that Meyer is kind of synonymous with. So as you can see here, right, I need to be either bent from the waist or bent from both legs to really get this nice and low. Once we've acquired that ridiculous low position, it becomes really simple because now I've lowered my targets. I've lowered or shrunk my targeting zones, right? They no longer have, from here to swing at. Now they're literally working at, half of that available targeting to work from. Once I'm down here, I'm going to engage their blade. He again talks about using the long edge. He brings the sword more vertical to, again, give myself that almost wall to hide behind. But instead, I'm not trying to hide behind it and move around. Here, I'm working. As this comes up, as this cut comes in, as thrust comes in, I'm binding and slicing through. So not a great demonstration on the bell, but if you can imagine, I'm just here. As that cut comes in, I'm just cutting down, dropping through that motion, really trying to slice off their blade, right? So I'm using a slicing action of my weapon to push their sword aside. So I'm not slicing off and doing anything else. I'm making a slice, I'm pushing through, I'm levering this part to do a slice and slide down. And that motion is what's pushing their thrust aside, setting their cut down, and kind of setting myself up for follow-through actions. The next one, I'm drawing a blank on the name immediately, but it's basically the slicing off, but to the other side. So what that means is I'm going to change. If they're cutting at me to my left side, they're cutting from here. Same exact thing. I'm starting nice and low, but now instead of turning aside and pushing off this way, I'm going to drop and slice across from the other side. So against my opponent here, starting off my low guard, coming under, and slicing down that outside. So the difference here between these two and why I put these together, even though they're not together in the book, is because they're very similar. And again, I always pull everything back to physics, right? Everything is just levers and bars and momentum and mechanics. It all makes sense to me. So if you imagine two conflicting forces, right? I don't want to, if this person is much bigger than I am, much stronger than I am, if I try to slice off, there's a chance I might overpower. There's a chance I might not be able to get what I need to happen out of this. So instead, if I come under it and I meet their force, or I don't meet their force, I blend with their force and push it aside more, I'm gonna have a much better chance of having control after my technique is done, after my press is done. So I'm really looking for, as the cut comes in, I'm coming underneath it and pushing it aside, as opposed to the normal slicing off. I kind of drop it here, get my sword above there for certain, and then I can slice down and control from there. And it's very interesting parallel between the two, but definitely different goals, definitely different end positions. These are definitely things you can just play with real simply. Again, if you simplify like this, you can practice the slicing off the Schneiden, come down, press. The other one, I'm just coming around it and pushing out the other way. And this becomes, as you can see, very fast, very simple motion to work through, and just really feel how that moves, how that plays. Even if you don't have a partner right now, you're stuck practicing at home with no one else, you can really start to feel like, okay, I can make this pressure. And I don't need to cut really hard. I can go from here, I can press, if I'm nice and low, I can really drop my body weight onto it even and start working from that. The fourth one, last one I'm talking about tonight, is the Demphin or something terrible like that. Again, don't quote my pronunciation, but it's his pressing actions. And these all come from the high cuts. So any kind of high vertical cut, we use to suppress, we use to cut, we use to control. This is something you see a lot of in the Dusak work we talked about a little bit before, but never to this level of fine tuning. So again, this time, instead of working out of low guard, working out of iron gate, which is kind of the center position for this, for Rappier. Notably about this one, we're going to match them as they come up for a cut. So as soon as my opponent goes up for a cut, I'm coming up with one of my own. And as they commit to a forward attacking action, I'm taking 2 steps. Meyer calls it a double step, but I'm assuming he means 2 normal steps to get away from that cut. So he sees a lot in the longsword stuff, a lot of these things where we're taking advantage of this angle of if they're cutting from my left side, I'm moving to my right to change that angle, to change that engagement. I get a little bit of safety out of this, but it's really not about voiding a cut. I'm not sitting here and going like, okay, if I move exactly this far away, there's no way they can hit me. Instead, it's, okay, I have this sort of bind, this sort of crossing here. Now if I move over here, now we have this kind of bind crossing. So yes, the angle does favor me if I move to the right as they're cutting, as they're moving, and they're ideally past the point where they can kind of correct for it. But it's less about that as much as, okay, so now the center line is no longer where their sword is. If they're lined up for a good cut and they're actually throwing a proper cut and, moving here, once that foot is planted, they can turn, but they can't really chase the same way. So we're kind of looking for that sort of timing of, okay, they're coming, I'm moving over here with my cut, resetting myself, planting both of my feet again, and I'm bringing this vertical cut down. And as far as where the cut goes, we're really looking to strike at the strong, the bottom third or so of their blade. We're looking to only strike the sword, knock it down, take it offline, and we're not even trying to control or strike afterward at this point. Meyer says in his book that basically that you can just keep doing the suppressing strikes until your opponent's arm gets tired, and then you can wound them easily, right? So this is not at all about, okay, I'm going to go here, I'm going to come up, and I'm going to strike them in the hand and knock them away. I'm purely aiming at their weapon, right? These techniques talking about tonight are all parries, they're all ways of dealing with, setting aside, controlling your opponent's weapon, keeping yourself safe, letting yourself find better opportunities to attack. The rapier, the side sword in particular, I find kind of interesting as a weapon, just because the length is kind of an awkward in between. Whereas with a long sword, the weapon is so long that I can kind of threaten and keep myself safe. I can kind of sit here with my long sword and say, okay, I'm safe, you can't do anything, but I can come to attack. And I want to keep my first entry cut kind of controlled, kind of out of the way. When you get to the shorter weapons like Messers or Dusak, I'm finding the opposite is true. Like, this is so close and so short of a weapon, I don't have a way of throwing that closing cut that we do with a long sword at range to get here. And so with Dusak, you need to be throwing these cuts super close, super early to let yourself close that distance. Then you can close again to actually make that strike. And the side sword, this rapier, is definitely that weird middle ground of, okay, I can't just throw these shortcuts out of range like a longsword can, but at the same time, I can't really just keep swinging this weapon like a Dusak would. I don't want to try to get close enough to just hit him outright like with other things. So it really becomes this complicated game of balancing the other weapons we have in our repertoire. And Meyer kind of referenced that indirectly. He says, like, okay, so you know longsword, we talked about Dusak, so we're not even talking about some fading and parrying and being deceitful with the weapon like we did with the Dusak a lot. Instead, this is very much like, how do I control, how do I work, how do I change my attacks and move things around? So I really think it's a interesting kind of unique weapon. Meyer has a lot of really great stuff in that, and I personally love taking it, applying it to my other weapons, my other trainings. So I'm kind of taking some time, the next couple of classes, next couple of videos, and just kind of digging into it, playing with things, playing with some highlights. So quick recap, quick review of the 4 concepts we talked about tonight. First is the Obsetsin, really simple. Whatever side they're cutting towards, whatever side they're engaging you to, you're going to press out into that iron gate, that long point-like position. From here, once you have pressed the sword or cut or thrust aside, you're able to move in and make the attack. And he said you should be able to do this from all 4 positions. So you should be able to, from high, drop this low to make the thrust. From outside guard over here, if he cuts in to my right, working from there. And same thing from high over here, bringing this down, working that through. Next parry we talked about was the Abschneiden, or the slicing off. This again, like the Obsession, is all about meeting the other person's blade, but instead of meeting with your strong, just set aside and make your own attack. With the Abschneiden, we're literally slicing off their blade. We're using our slice to set their cut off. So Absetsin, think about setting it off, you're catching it and pushing it aside. Abschneiden, we're here, we're putting a slice, and we're really trying to move their blade with a slice, with a press of the wrist, with a lean of the body, like you would a good slice. Follow up to that, again, I'm drawing a blank on its name, something weird. I'm going to start as like I'm going to meet, but now instead of meeting against their cut, I'm going to come in behind their cut and slice it away. So again, starting that same low guard, I'm coming under their weapon, back up, and slicing down. It's important to keep in mind when you're doing the slices that you are pushing low, you are pushing it down and away. I know that doesn't really show up very well against a static Pel, but you can really feel that I should be pushing this down. I want to be driving down behind it and controlling that weapon, controlling that attack. Last option is the suppressing cut, the Dämpfen from high. Again, we're not going to start high. As their sword comes up, we're coming up to meet them. From here, as they cut, I'm doing a 2 steps, getting to the outside, moving away from that attack, and then cutting down onto the strong. Meyer does go into detail about how to really make that lever work, really pulling down, leading with the hilt, right? But pulling everything down in that straight line. This one in particular, he really highlights that this is not something that is being used to attack, it's used to control, to keep yourself safe. And at the extreme, you can just tire them out, just suppressing their cut every time until eventually they get tired and you can take a free shot. So that's it for tonight. If there's any questions or comments on these, definitely comment below, email us, comment or reach out to us on Facebook, through our website. Lots of ways to get in touch, guys. Otherwise, have a great night, enjoy your weekend, and we're back on Monday with some more Jude Liu. Thanks.